May I have your attention, please? I hope you are having a pleasant metabolism and are able to listen to me. I would like to present briefly on our mentors, the MRI mentors, Gregory Bateson, Don D. Jackson, Milton H. Erickson, and Heinz von Foerster. To give you a little idea how things developed over time and how we participated and then went ahead from the general view of science. The traditional view of science is based on two concepts, matter and energy, as you know. And in our field, only about 100 years ago, the concept of energy was introduced by Freud with his concept of the libido. As you know, this is a slightly sticky liquid that never quite abandons positions that it has reached once. If it is held up, then it builds up and reactivates former lines. But in any case, as I say, the concept of energy was introduced in the field by Freud. Until then, people were supposed to be the way they were born. Lombroso, for instance, the famous Italian, the man of the Italian Renaissance, in his book Il Reo Nato, postulated that some people are born criminals, just like other people are born with brown or blue eyes. And as I say, the great change came with Freud. And then, eventually, of course, especially after the end of the Second World War, the concept of communication, of information first and then communication, entered into our field. Gregory Bateson had a very, very interesting kind of way of referring to this change from a merely energetic viewpoint, like for instance in classical psychoanalysis, to the communicational viewpoint. He says, if the foot of a walking man hits a pebble, then energy is transferred from the shoe to the stone, and the stone then is displaced. And if we had a way of measuring all of this exactly, we would know exactly beforehand already where this stone is going to finish its movement. But, says Gregory, if the stone hits a dog, the dog may jump up and bite the man, because he feels threatened or attacked. In that case, the energy required to jump up and bite the man is no longer transmitted by the stone. It comes from within the animal itself, and the movement of the stone has become a piece of information. It is a communication, at least the way the dog sees it. So this is a nice image that Gregory Bateson used to refer precisely to the difference between a purely energy-based assumption and the addition of a third important concept to matter and energy, namely information. Energy was also exceeded, and they went beyond energy in the famous Josiah Macy conferences in the late 1940s and early 1950s, in which cybernetics was gradually developed. And Gregory Bateson was a member of that conference. He was an anthropologist, and together with the psychiatrist Rüsch, they wrote a very, very famous and basic, fundamental book, Communication, the Social Matrix of Psychiatry. It became a truly basic, fundamental introduction into this new view of human behavior. The Bateson group was composed by Weakland, Haley, and Fry, and this group was formed after Gregory Bateson received in the early 1950s, in 1952, a rather nice grant from the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation to study the pragmatic aspects of communication. Communication had already been studied as far as syntactics was concerned, i.e. the mere kind of structure of information, and also semantics, that is the relationship between the sign and the meaning of the sign. But pragmatics, the study of the, as I would say, behavioral effects of communication, had not yet been studied at all, or almost not at all. And it was the Bateson group with that grant that began to study this new and additional aspect of communication. And it was very interesting how they began to study communication wherever they found it. Gregory Bateson, for instance, wrote on the play behavior of animals in the zoo. As you know, animal play has the appearances of combat, but as Bateson postulated, since they seem to enjoy it and don't hurt each other when they play, there has to be a message that defines the subsequent behavior, i.e., my behavior is not a threat, my behavior is play. So Gregory Bateson studied the play behavior of animals in the zoo. Then he studied the relationship between the blind dogs, the dogs of the blind, and his master, the blind, the intricate communication going on between the human and the dog. And among many other things, they also studied the relationship between a ventriloquist and his puppet. Don't ask me exactly what came out of it. I think Gregory Bateson was interested in how does a person behave if he wants to give the impression that there are two people there. One is... Anyway, and that was one of the studies that they made. The decisive moment, as far as we in our work are concerned, the decisive moment came when, by sheer coincidence, the Bateson group was given a number of offices in the Menlo Park VA hospital. Menlo Park, as you know, is a city adjoining Palo Alto. And for those of you who don't know, who have come from abroad and don't know what a VA hospital is, a VA hospital in the United States are hospitals for ex-members of the armed forces. And in this particular hospital in Menlo Park, they had mostly psychiatric patients. So the Bateson group came into daily contact with people, so-called mental patients, out in the park or in the cafeteria and so on. And this is where I think the decisive change occurred. Gregory Bateson, I repeat, was an anthropologist. And the anthropologist approaches the objects of his study in a very different way from the psychiatrist. The psychiatrist approaches the particular human behavior that is exhibited by that person with a theoretical idea already in his head about this particular diagnosis. And he now tries to find out to what extent this specific behavior applies to the general idea, the psychiatric basis of this particular diagnosis. Being an anthropologist, Gregory Bateson did precisely not this, but rather he did what an anthropologist does. The anthropologist approaches the objects of his study with a minimum, the humanly possible minimum of preconceived ideas. He is a passive but very attentive observer. And he asks himself, let me find out how this particular tribe or society or culture functions. What are the rules of their interaction? And in doing this, Gregory Bateson became interested in seeing, first of all, he asked himself, let me understand how this seemingly so crazy behavior, if looked at in isolation, into what kind of human relationship system does this behavior fit? And this, for the Bateson group, was the beginning of the study of the families of so-called mental patients. Gregory Bateson began to invite the families, and he paid careful attention not to the crazy behavior, but to the interaction in that family system. And one of the many things that he found out is that in these families, there is a rather large percentage of so-called paradoxical messages. And this eventually led to the publication of the famous first paper towards a theory of schizophrenia, in which the Bateson group postulated the by now very important concept of the double bind. Now, the moment Gregory Bateson began to work with so-called psychiatric patients, he had a need for a psychiatric consultant, and he found him in the person of Don Jackson, who already himself, as I shall explain a little later, had begun to work with systems. Even though he was a trained psychoanalyst, he had begun to work with couples and entire families. But in any case, this was the beginning of the family therapy work by the Bateson group. MRI was founded by Don Jackson in 1959. The Bateson group never belonged to the MRI. MRI never belonged to the Bateson group, but the two groups worked closely together. It was a very fruitful and certainly a highly interesting collaboration between those two groups. Just to give you an idea of what an extraordinary man Gregory Bateson was, some information. Gregory Bateson, for instance, had every Tuesday evening, he had an open house, and anybody who was interested could come and participate in this in a conversation. Every week, Gregory Bateson had some kind of important or well-known scientist there. And it didn't matter. One week it was an astronomer, and the other week it was a musicologist, and the next week it was, engineer. But Gregory had this kind of an almost, Renaissance type width of knowledge. He was capable of maintaining a meaningful conversation with every one of those, with every one of the people who were coming from very, very different areas. He was capable of having a real, good, and highly interesting conversation. So the famous Gregory Bateson open houses, unfortunately, were never repeated by anybody else. They disappeared together with Gregory Bateson, who went to the Virgin Islands in order to study the language of the dolphins, which unfortunately never came to any kind of concrete results. As I already said, Don D. Jackson was a member of the Bateson team at first, until in 1959 he founded the Institute, and I had the honor of being accepted by him into this institute a year later. So after Jules Riskin, I am the second most senior member of the Institute. Don D. Jackson had set out as a psychoanalyst, but he had, as he returned to Palo Alto and established his private practice, he found it rather difficult to maintain in Palo Alto at that time, because it was a rather small city, to maintain the absolute exclusiveness of the doctor-patient relationship as Freud had conceptualized it. It happened to him over and over again that he went to a restaurant or to the cinema and he ran into one of his patients who then said, "Oh, Dr. Jackson, let me introduce you to my wife and my children." And this, of course, from the psychoanalytic point of view, is totally unacceptable. Huh? So Jackson, in his own words, basing himself on the saying, "If you can't fight them, join them," began to see couples and families. And I must tell you, Jackson was just the most unbelievable therapist I have ever had the honor of meeting. He was capable, and we still have some tapes, that show that Jackson was capable of beginning to do therapy within the first 10 minutes of the first session. It was simply unbelievable, his ability. He had an intuition for what we nowadays would call the interaction, the patterns, and so on in those families, and began to make his active interventions. Just to give you a couple of anecdotes out of Jackson's work so to get a better feel how really extraordinary this man was. He, one day, he was working, he'd already been working for several sessions with a gentleman who suddenly in the middle of the session said, "Dr. Jackson, there are hidden microphones in your office. And Jackson precisely did not say, come on, what makes you think this, or what in your past gives you the idea that here in my office there would be hidden. No, none of this. Jackson got up and began to immediately look for those microphones. I'm sorry, not microscopes, microphones. Yeah? He started pulling out books of the bookshelves and asked his client to help him look for them, pulled up the carpets. And after about 15 minutes, the client said, Dr. Jackson, I don't think this is so important. Let's continue with the session. Another little episode, one day at the VA hospital, they asked him to give a presentation of how one begins to establish a contact with a mute patient. And they had found an excellent case for him. It was a patient who had been there already for a long time and believed that he was God, and therefore had refused to talk to anybody, to participate in any kind of ward activities. So they had brought him to the lecture room, and the patient sat there staring at the audience, the mostly psychiatric residents. And Jackson first tried the usual methods of establishing contact with mute patients, and he didn't get anywhere. So he got up from his chair, walked over, knelt down in case of the patient, and held up the ward key. It was a closed ward, of course, and said to the patient, if you are God, then you have more right to this key than I. On the other hand, if you aren't God, then I think it is risky for you not to watch carefully what's going on around you. And with this, he got up from his knees and went back to his chair. The patient grabbed his chair, ran over, sat down in front of Jackson and said, "Man, one of the two of us is crazy." I wasted the first 2 or 3 years of my life at the Mental Research Institute by trying to put together a so-called structured family interview. This was an interview that was supposed to give us a new interactional a list of diagnoses of interactional nature. I also thought that this interview, that consisted of 5 simple communication tasks, would then become also an instrument to measure change. We would run this interview at the beginning of a family therapy, and then the same interview at the end, and then we would have some objective, concrete proof of what kind of change, if any, has taken place in the course of the treatment. Unfortunately, this didn't work out. But let me mention that one of the 5 tasks was to ask the parents, in absence of their children, how, out of all the millions of people in the world, did the 2 of you get together? And we did precisely this. We pointed at them in a symmetrical fashion and stared to the floor until one of them began to speak. We were not interested in the information. We were interested in how, in the interaction that ensued this question. So we were interested who started first, how they agreed, how they disagreed, and so on. After having collected about 60 such interviews, it occurred to me that for the case of scientific respectability, I also needed some normal families. If you have ever tried to do this, to include normal families, into your list, you will know the difficulties. After searching for a long, long time, I found 3 normal families. And so every Wednesday morning for 2 hours, we played to Don Jackson these structured interviews. He did not know the people. He did not know their names. He didn't know their age. He didn't know why they had come to the institute. He didn't know if they had children, etc. All he had was the voices on the tape. And invariably, Jackson, at the end of it, would give us the correct diagnosis. And not something so vague like, well, they sound schizophrenic. No. I clearly remember one example. If they have a son, he is probably a delinquent. If they have a daughter, she probably has psychosomatic disorders. And he was right every single time. And we asked him, Don, how do you do it? Please, what? Huh? And he would then give us such a revealing answer like, well, you know, the wife laughs at that point. So after this, after I had found those three normal families, I played the most normal of the three normals. I played to Jackson, and for the first time, Jackson said, I don't know. I played again. So we played it again, and he said, I still don't know. To me, they sound normal. Anyway, in his work in the Southern Pacific, especially in the island of Bali, Gregory Bateson had come across the phenomena of spontaneous trance during the ritual temple dances, and he got very interested in hypnosis and hypnotic states. So when he returned and formed his group, he heard about the work of Milton Erickson, and they met, and they were very interested in each other. And John Weakland and Jay Haley went to Phoenix many, many times, and they came back to us, the two groups, with fantastically interesting examples of Ericksonian interventions that really, I mean, they were so enriching, they were so important that certainly Erickson became our third great mentor. I myself, unfortunately, have only had the honor to meet him twice, very briefly, but Jay Haley and John Weakland saw him frequently and came back, I repeat, with really the most invaluable information on specific interventions. Erickson was an absolute master also in his application of language, of the intricacies and the possibilities inherent simply in the way he would structure his language and so on. So a great deal of our work at the Brief Therapy Center is derived from this Ericksonian behavior prescription and so like. Now, our fourth mentor, Heinz von Foerster, is used to work as a professor of biocybernetics and gained international reputation. I had the pleasure of inviting him to one of the Don D. Jackson Memorial Conferences, because back in the late 1970s, as we began to these conferences, unfortunately, Don Jackson had already died about 10 years earlier. Let me mention also in fairness, if a psychiatrist is found dead in his bed on a Monday morning, invariably people believe he must have committed suicide. As far as I know, no. There were traces of barbiturates, yes, found by the coroner, but in a perfectly normal sleep-producing dosage. Jackson had been ill. He had been treated, and Carlos Lusky from Argentina, from Buenos Aires, who then became our director much later, had a conversation with him on Friday evening during dinner. Friday evening before Jackson was found dead in his bed on Monday morning. And believe me, Carlos is a good therapist. And he said he had absolutely no reason to believe that he was talking to somebody who was about to commit suicide. In fact, Jackson talked a great deal in a very positive way about his plans for the future. So let me just put this in as a important, for me, very important point. We then organized every 2 years the so-called Don D. Jackson Memorial Conferences, and I had the great pleasure and honor to have Heinz von Foerster as a speaker at one of our first conferences. And in this way, Heinz von Foerster became interested in the application of the work he had so far done in the purely bio-cybernetic field onto human relations. And he came up with especially lately with the concept that for us is very, very significant, and that is the second-order cybernetics. That is to say, not only to study the functioning of a system, but to take into account also the observer who studies the system, and thereby creates another level that he calls the second-order cybernetic level in through his observations. And this is in keeping with things I would like to mention tomorrow, with realizations that had been arrived at in theoretical physics and in other fields that apparently have nothing to do with our field, but where it becomes clear that people even like Einstein, Schrödinger, Heisenberg and others already realized that the observation itself has an influence on what we observe. That to believe that we are outsiders and just watch the thing over there in a most objective fashion is just plain nonsense. All right, that is a very brief introduction into the history of MRI. We have a saying in Palo Alto, and that is that the fame of the Institute increases by the square of the distance from Palo Alto. In Palo Alto, almost nobody knows us, but in San Francisco already, and in New York, and even in Europe and in South America, we are well known. I had the great pleasure of, since I was a clinical professor of psychiatry. I'm now emeritus at Stanford, but my job was supervision of psychiatric residents, and I remember one of my residents came and told me that she and her husband had been on a trip in Western Africa, in Senegal or in Mali, I forget exactly where. She was interested in seeing those the equivalents of mental hospitals in those countries. And in one of those hospitals, there was a huge courtyard crammed with people, the patients and their families and the doctors and the nurses, everything together. And then one of the people there asked them, where are you from? And so she said, we are from Stanford University. Stanford University, and where is that? It's in Palo Alto. Ah, double bind, huh? Thank you.